I got off work at 6 a.m. The beauty about working graveyard shift was that no matter how busy the night was, things wound down about 4:30 or 5 o'clock. That meant I had plenty of time to get my paperwork done and get out on time. By 6:30, I was home and usually in bed. But I needed to get my Jeep serviced, so I'd made an appointment to drop it off. I used a local guy to get the work done. He was honest and cheaper than any of the bigger mechanics in town, but the only downside was that he had weird hours. I couldn't drop the car off until 9:30. Not enough time to go to sleep and not wake up like something out of a George Romero movie, so I just stayed up. I got myself a cup of coffee and sat down in front of the TV. About 9 a.m., the local stations broke into regular programming. Something big was happening at the World Trade Center in New York. They cut in for a live broadcast. I saw Flight 175 hit the South Tower live on air. I didn't leave the couch that day. It's time to start telling our own stories. I'm Steve Kellums, and welcome to Blue Canary. September 11th, 2001 is a day that Americans should never forget. I say should because as we sit here on the anniversary of the biggest attack on American soil since the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, I can't help but think that many of us have forgotten. We've forgotten the sacrifice. We've forgotten what we lost. The exact number of victims, particularly the number of those killed at the World Trade Center, is not definitively known. However, the official death toll, after numerous revisions and not including the 19 terrorists, was set at 2,977 people. At the World Trade Center in New York City, 2,753 people died, of whom 343 were firefighters. The death toll at the Pentagon near Washington, D.C. was 184, and 40 individuals died outside of Shanksville, Pennsylvania when Flight 93 crashed into a field. 72 law enforcement officers died on 9/11. Since then, hundreds have succumbed to injuries sustained during the rescue attempts. 72 in one day. In honor of those 2,977 victims, of the 343 firefighters, and of the 72 police officers, I want to take a moment and remind all of you about what happened. September 11th, 2001, 5:45 a.m. Mohammed Atta and Abdul Aziz Al-Omari, two of the intended hijackers, passed through security at the Portland International Jetport in Maine. They board a commuter flight to Boston Logan International Airport, and then they board American Airlines Flight 11. 7:59 a.m. Flight 11 takes off from Boston, headed for Los Angeles, California. There are 76 passengers, 11 crew members, and 5 hijackers on board. 8:15 a.m. United Airlines Flight 175 takes off from Boston, also headed for Los Angeles. There are 51 passengers, 9 crew members, and 5 hijackers on board. 8:19 a.m. A flight attendant on Flight 11, Betty Ann Ong, alerts ground personnel that a hijacking is underway and that the cockpit is unreachable. 8:20 a.m. American Airlines Flight 77 takes off from Dulles, outside of Washington, D.C., headed for Los Angeles. There are 53 passengers, 6 crew members, and 5 hijackers on board. 8:24 a.m., Mohammed Atta, a hijacker on Flight 11, unintentionally alerts air controllers in Boston to the attack. He meant to press the button that allowed him to talk to the passengers on his flight. 8:37 a.m. After hearing the broadcast from Atta on Flight 11, Boston Air Traffic Control alerts the U.S. Air Force's Northeast Defense Sector, who then mobilized the Air National Guard to follow the planes. 8:42 a.m. United Flight 93 takes off from Newark, New Jersey after a delay due to routine traffic. It was headed for San Francisco, California. There are 33 passengers, 7 crew members, and 4 hijackers on board. 8:46 a.m. Flight 11 crashes into the World Trade Center North Tower. All passengers aboard are instantly killed, and employees of the World Trade Center are trapped above the 91st floor. 9:03 a.m. Flight 175 crashes into the World Trade Center's South Tower. All passengers aboard are killed instantly, and so are an unknown number of people in the tower. And to this day, I am struggling to say that out loud. 9:05 a.m. President George W. Bush, in an elementary school classroom in Florida, is informed about the hit on the second tower. His chief of staff, Andrew Card, whispers the chilling news into the president's ear. Bush later wrote about his response. I made the decision not to jump up immediately and leave the classroom. I didn't want to rattle the kids. I wanted to project a sense of calm. I had been in enough crises to know that the first thing the leader has to do is to project calm. 9:28 a.m. Hijackers attack on Flight 93. 9:37 a.m. Flight 77 crashes into the Pentagon. All passengers aboard are instantly killed, and so are 125 civilian and military personnel in the building. 9:45 a.m. U.S. airspace is shut down under Operation Yellow Ribbon. All civilian aircraft are ordered to land at the nearest airport. 9:55 a.m. Air Force One with President George W. Bush aboard takes off from Florida. 9:57 a.m. Passengers aboard Flight 93 begin to run up toward the cockpit. Jarrara, the pilot, begins to roll the plane back and forth in an attempt to destabilize the revolt. 9:59 a.m. The South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. 10:02 a.m. Flight 93 plows into an empty field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Although its ultimate target is unknown, it was likely headed for either the White House or the U.S. Capitol. 10:18 a.m. President Bush authorizes any non-grounded planes to be shot down. At that time, all 4 hijacked planes had already crashed, but the president's team was operating under the impression that Flight 93 was still in the air. 10:28 a.m. The North Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. 10:53 a.m. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld orders the U.S. military to move to a higher state of alert, going to DEFCON 3. 11:45 a.m. Air Force One lands at Barksdale Air Force Base near Shreveport, Louisiana. 12:15 p.m. Airspace in the United States is completely free of all commercial and private flights. 1:30 p.m. Air Force One leaves Barksdale. 2:30 p.m., Rudy Giuliani, the mayor of New York City, visits the fallen Twin Towers at the World Trade Center at what becomes known as Ground Zero. 3 p.m., Air Force One lands at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, and President Bush is immediately taken to a secure bunker that is capable of withstanding a nuclear attack. 4:30 p.m., Air Force One leaves Offutt and heads back towards Andrews Air Force Base near Washington, D.C. 5:30 p.m., Building 7 of the World Trade Center collapses. 8:30 p.m., President Bush addresses the nation. That night I went to work. I was in a daze. I remember we didn't take a call for service. The criminals stayed home and were glued to the TV. I also remember a very heated discussion about taking the squads to New York City. We wanted to help. We felt like we needed to help, but calmer heads prevailed. We didn't know the city. We would be more of a hindrance than a help. We needed to stay here and keep our eyes open for more attacks. Every morning at 5 a.m., a Little Greasy Spoon restaurant opened for breakfast, and there was always a cop or two in there eating. We tended to sit at a big round table in the back corner. September 12th was no different. Well, actually, it was very different. The place had its regulars, but there was not any morning banter, no talking. It was very quiet. Suddenly, a man stood up from across the room and walked over to our table. I was the closest to him, and I turned as he approached. He stuck his hand out to shake. I want to thank you for what you do. I want to thank you for what you do, he said. What most people don't realize is that cops weren't very popular coming out of the 90s. Crime was up and Hollywood had done a number on us. The propaganda was that all cops were crooked. I've been a cop for 10 years, and not once in my career had anyone thanked me for what I did. 10 years. That all changed on 9/11. I get emotional every time I think of that morning. I find myself in tears reading through this account of the events of that day. Every time I think about it, I realize 72 officers had to die, trying their best to save lives for everyday citizens, to realize that what we do is important, that what we do matters. 72 officers had to die. I refuse to let that sacrifice go unremembered. This one's for you. New York City Police Department. John G. Coughlin, Sergeant. Michael Curtin, Sergeant. John D'Alera, Police Officer. Vincent G. Dans, Police Officer. Jerome M. Dominguez, Police Officer. Stephen P. Driscoll, Police Officer. Mark Ellis, Police Officer. Robert Fazio, police officer. Rodney Gillis, sergeant. Ronald Klopfer, police officer. Thomas Langone, police officer. James Leahy, police officer. Brian G. McDonald, police officer. John William Perry, police officer. Glenn Pettit, police officer. Claude Richards, detective. Timothy Roy, sergeant. Moira Smith, police officer. Ramon Suarez, police officer. Paul Talty, police officer. Santos Valentine Jr., police officer. Joseph Vincent Vigiano, detective. Walter Weaver, police officer. Port Authority of New York and New Jersey Police Department. Christopher C. Amorosa, police officer. Maurice Vincent Berry, police officer. Liam Callahan, police officer. Robert D. Cirrus, Sr., lieutenant. Clinton Davis, Sr., police officer. Donald A. Foreman, police officer. Greg John Foreigner, police officer. Thomas Edward Gorman, police officer. Uhura Ganja Houston, police officer. George G. Howard, police officer. Stephen Hooksco, Jr., police officer. Anthony P. Infante, Jr., inspector. Paul W. Juergens, police officer. Robert M. Kalfers, sergeant. Paul Lashchinsky, police officer. David P. Lemaine, police officer. John J. Lennon, police officer. J. D. Levi, police officer. James F. Lynch, police officer. Kathy N. Mazza, captain. Donald J. McIntyre, police officer. Walter Arthur McNeil, police officer. Fred V. Marone, superintendent. Joseph M. Navas, police officer. James A. Nelson, police officer. Alfonso J. Niedermeyer III, police officer. James W. Parham, police officer. Dominic Pizzulo, police officer. Bruce A. Reynolds, police officer. Antonio Jose Rodriguez, police officer. Richard Rodriguez, police officer. James A. Romito, chief. John P. Scala, police officer. Walwyn W. Stewart, Jr., police officer. Kenneth F. Teachin, police officer. Nathaniel Webb, police officer. Michael T. Holy, police officer. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Richard Jerry Gudiano, refugee manager. Secret Service and FBI. Craig James Miller, Master Special Officer, U.S. Secret Service. Leonard W. Hatton, Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigations. New York City Fire Department. Ronald P. Bucca, Fire Marshal. New York State Office of Court Administration and Department of Taxation and Finance. Thomas E. Juergens, Senior Court Officer. William Harry Thompson, Captain. Mitchell Scott Wallace, Senior Court Officer. Clyde Frazier, Jr., Crime Specialist. Charles M. Mills, Director of Investigations. Richard R. Moore, Revenue Crimes. Salvatore Papasso, Revenue Crimes. William H. Pullman, Assistant Deputy. And that's the story we have to tell.
Thank you for joining. As always, I'm curious what questions you're getting asked. What isn't the news covering? What story needs to be told? Connect with me at bluecanarypodcast@gmail.com.